We are going to burst Canberra's bubble tonight, and we do it with the aid of data we get out of the real world. Now, the Prime Minister is still patting himself on the back for the too little too late tax cut, thinking that that somehow is going to change the electoral fortunes. And yes, I'm not going to pretend that there aren't things like Newspoll that have said the majority of Australians understand that he needed to blah, blah, blah. But we've got some real reality today that bursts the Canberra bubble of spin. Remember, more than half of the country has little or no knowledge about the too little too late tax cuts because they're still living in a place where 109,000 people lost a full-time job in December, and now the unemployment rate has increased. For a while, both sides of politics have had a number with a 3 in front of it, but now we start to move where we long feared that if unemployment stays above 4 and goes to 4.5%, then it is, well, thousands, tens of thousands of people who are going to start losing their job. In fact, already this month alone, there are 22,000 more people who have joined the unemployment queues. And when you have a look at this graph, this is the number of hours that are worked by Australians, full-time, part-time, casual. You can start to see that that is now inching backwards and starting to take us very close to 2022 levels when the numbers were a scenario that, of course, we changed a government in. Also, underreported tonight are the number of people who are underemployed. They can't get enough work. They can't work enough hours. That is now 6.6%. It's up by almost a full point in just 1 month. December was bad. January now seems that it was continuing the pullback, and we'll find out formally in the next few weeks where we are moving towards the end of this month. Well, on top of all of this, again, the reality that bursts the Canberra bubble, 3,000 jobs at risk in Western Australia because there's a serious threat to the nickel operations of BHP. However, the way that Chalmers was spinning things in the Parliament today deserves some notice and then a comment from yours truly.
We saw unemployment tick up to 4.1%, and nobody likes to see that, Mr Speaker, but we need some perspective here. As the member for Parramatta said in his contribution a moment ago, average unemployment under this government is 3.6%. Average unemployment under those opposite, 5.6%, Mr Speaker.
Now, of course, those figures are misleading, and the comparison, when you inevitably see it pumped out by either the friendly staff working on the behalf of the Prime Minister's dirt unit in media operations around the country, or the social media that people will be bombarded with in the Dunkley by-election and then most likely a federal election later this year. Marketing in diaries anywhere August, September, October is most likely when they're going to seriously think about doing it. Well, of course, you know what fiddled with the average numbers of the previous government. This little thing called the coronavirus lockdowns, when literally people didn't go to work, or people by their hundreds of thousands saw their hours cut back or lose their jobs completely. That, of course, was the reality. Another thing that is absolutely bursting the Canberra bubble of spin that everything is awesome and we have turned a corner for the better continues to be more information about cost of living. Now, the Prime Minister and his Treasurer made a bunch of slippery announcements and promises and changes and lies towards the end of January and through the first 2 weeks of sitting of the federal parliament this year. But there's plenty of data that is around that tells us that Australian people are still being choked by the python of cost of living, as they were last year when, of course, this government took $1,500 off 10 million workers. Now, the reality is interest rates are very high compared to where they were when this government took over. Remember, when this government took over, the interest rates were just 0.35 for the cash rate. Commercial rates are always higher. And then by now, it's 4.35. Now, remember when interest rates went up in May before the last election, Grim Jim had this to say about what interest rate increases means.
This is a full-blown cost of living crisis on Scott Morrison's watch. When things are going well in the economy, he takes all of the credit. And when times are tough in the economy, he takes none of the responsibility.
Well, of course, there's been more than a dozen increases since the sky was falling because of cost of living. And we learn today that despite all of the claims out of Canberra, which are overtly political, that we've turned the corner, everything's okay, the suburbs are now hugging their local Labor MP, we learn in the past couple of days from the boss of the Commonwealth Bank, Matt Comyn, who's echoed the comments of the boss of the ANZ Bank, which is do not expect interest rates to come down until 2025. Now, this is in line with what the Reserve Bank has said, where they have said the best case scenario is some reduction by 2026. But even if that takes place, you will still be paying 75% of what you are currently paying. But the picture for this year is that the huge increases in interest rates, well, they will remain at a pain all this year and into 2025. If things do get slightly better, you'll still be paying 75% of the increased payments since this government came to power. If you want to talk about comparisons, that's the reality. Since this government has come to power, they have pretended that every decision that they have made is for the better, but as we have told you, as we have shown you, they have been more than happy to see petrol taxes ever increase. In fact, they have overseen indexation increases, which means the rate of tax has increased on everything from a bottle of Bundy all the way through to how much people are paying back when it comes to their university debts. Now, they may well think that they've won over the press gallery, then automatically they'll win over the public, but the public know nothing is changing. In fact, I want to show you what was on the West Australian newspaper today, which talks about a poll of Western Australians, and they're having to deal with cost of living right now. The expectations are that after the belt tightening of 2023, the absolute no meat to cut and cutting into the bone of 2024, there's even more pressure on such families going into the rest of this year. Meantime, outside of Perth, in places like regional Western Australia, and it's very similar in other parts of the country, their cost of living scenario is 15% worse than what's happening in capital cities. Now, in the past couple of days, the federal government has responded to what we have been talking about for a long time here, which is the number of Australians, 3.7 million of them last year, who needed assistance to put a meal on the table. Lines at food banks around the country, well, they were very big in the lead up to, and they have not changed post-Christmas. In fact, according to the headlines that wrote about this phenomena in the Turnbull Times, without them I'd be starving. Cost of living crisis forcing more Australians than ever to rely on food banks. Now, this government has, in the previous 12 months, a budget surplus of more than $20 billion. They have money to help, and we learn that they are going to shave off this much to help those people who rely upon things like food banks and other charities. In fact, Amanda Rishworth, the federal minister responsible here, announced this week, here's her official press release, $14.5 million to provide more money to the people who are struggling when it comes to food. But forgive me if I do not praise the minister when, as you know, the federal government is going to be spending more than double that on ads to sell the too late, too little, too late tax cuts. Now, let's be very clear here. This is yet another broken promise, this use of $40 million of your money to tell you that the government is very generously going to allow you to hold on to $15 a week more of your money. It's a broken promise because remember what the now Prime Minister said about the former government when it used taxpayer money to sell political agendas.
This business of not calling the election so that he can use taxpayers' money for ads is just yet the latest example of a Prime Minister who thinks that taxpayers' money is the same as Liberal Party money.
Well, separate the word Liberal, put in Labor, and it's exactly the same about this Prime Minister. Literally, queues around the block for people who are waiting for the assistance of places like Food Bank. The best they can get in extra funding is $14 million. The federal government plans to spend $40 million trying to convince you that $15 a week is apparently enough to not just put food back on the table, but to be able to pay the higher prices for booze, the higher prices for smokes, the higher prices when you go to the supermarket, the higher prices for rent, the higher prices for paying off your house. Now, again, these are the numbers. I show them to you every night because when you hear big numbers about X $1,000, that's over the year. But it's just $15, $22, $32 or $41 a week. It's too little, too late. Now, welcome to the reality of Albonomics. They can spin as hard as they like. They can be cheered on by the media as much as they want. And, geez, don't I have an example of that for you tonight. But the reality is, under Albo, higher prices, higher rates, and now higher unemployment.